where do we look at and where do we find ideas of death and dying and rituals around death and dying, the meaning of this transition out of life from non-white, non-colonial, non-Christian traditions?
Today is Wednesday, January 20th. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I am your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Hello and welcome to No Easy Answers, a show about philosophy, politics, and the human condition. Thank you for tuning in from wherever you happen to be listening. I'm really happy to have you with us here today. As always, if you'd like to support the show, you can share these episodes on your social media, follow us on Twitter at noeasyanswerspodcast, or leave us a positive review in Apple Podcasts. No Easy Answers is completely listener supported, so with your help, I'd like to keep it that way. If you'd like to support the show with a small monthly donation, you can now subscribe to our brand new Patreon page. Just head to www.patreon.com/noeasyanswers. Every little bit helps, and it keeps me creating episodes that I hope you find enriching and well worth your time that you spend listening. So, just as a quick aside, before we get into today's episode, you know that this show, if you've been listening for a while, we wrestle with some pretty deep questions. And most of these questions do not have a set way they ought to be answered, and that's why the show is called No Easy Answers. But you know, as I engage with these questions, a thought occurred to me the other day, in that I don't want to leave my listenership out to sea. Some of these questions may make you feel uncomfortable. Some of them may decenter deeply held beliefs, and all of this can be unsettling to say the least. So in an effort to give listeners a sort of mooring so that no one is lost at sea without a compass, I figured we might as well have a variety of ways in which you can interact with the show and the guests I invite to be on this show. So in addition to the brand new Patreon page, you can now join the conversation on Reddit and hang out with us on Discord. You can always send us a voicemail or send us an email at noeasyanswerspodcast@gmail.com. So for now on, in addition to the links and episode summary I usually leave in with the show notes, I'll leave links to all the various ways you can interact with the show as well. In today's episode, I have a fascinating conversation with Michelle Acciavatti. Michelle is a funeral home director and an end-of-life specialist working in Vermont. She is a board member of the National Funeral Home Alliance, president and co-founder of Vermont Natural Burial. She is president of Green Burial Vermont, and she is a founding member of the Collective for Radial Death Studies. Now, she and I spoke about her role as a death doula and her role as a funeral director, and we spoke about the general labor of death. As you'll hear in our conversation, we talked about death from many angles, from the arranging of a funeral to guiding people through their end-of-life transition, and there's even some radical politics thrown in there. Now, this is our fourth episode exploring the concept of death, and you know, I can't promise you there won't be another episode on death at some point in the future. So after this conversation, if you haven't had your fill on this topic, check out some of our more recent episodes titled On Death 1 through 3. Here is my conversation with Michelle Acciavatti. Welcome to No Easy Answers. Really excited to have you here with us today. Because so much of what you do is of interest to me, whether it's the Green Burial Center for Radial Death Studies, the Death Cafe. Basically, the labor of death is what we're focusing on today. And like I said, I'm really excited to have you with us. And before we start with any sort of heavy hitter questions about death and existentialism and all that good stuff, I wanted to ask because I read an article about you, and there was a line at the end of your article in which you said, being an end-of-life specialist is, quote, truly my calling in life. So I want to ask an origins question, but I want to frame it properly, because not so much what inspired you to get involved in this work, but Can you speak to some of your experience that shaped your perspectives on being called to this line of work?
Yeah. I mean, so actually, that answer goes right back into how I got started with this work, which was, I mean, I think in part, I've always been drawn to these sort of liminal spaces where people are becoming or transitioning or something like that. So originally, I wanted to work with infants, and I was really interested in the relationship between cognitive development and motor development. So infants, mainly preemies. And sort of that had gone through these very different last few months of motor development because they weren't tumbling around in the womb, they were in an incubator. And, you know, in the course of that work, I was working at a major children's hospital. I saw a lot of death. And I'd had a relationship there with the ethics committee. And a lot of times the death that was happening because the decision had been made to withhold or withdraw or no longer continue with life-sustaining treatment. And so I was watching these parents facing what is the hardest decision anybody is going to have to make in their life. At the best hospital in the world, you know, I mean, and with support, whether it's in their own language, with their own religion, you know, whether, you know, social services support. I mean, they had all the support that they could want. And there was just something missing. And that was just sort of this, I was having a conversation with a really good friend who's a midwife and a birth doula. And so I'm talking to her about these experiences of, you know, observing, being at a table when somebody's making a decision about life-sustaining treatment, about continuing life, and, you know, and just feeling like that there was something missing from the way these parents were being supported in that. And so that was, and she looked at me and she said, "You should be a death doula." And I was like, "What the fuck is a death doula? I'd never heard of this." You know, and this is in 2013. There wasn't even a Wikipedia entry for this. So we talked a lot. We'd been talking a lot because she was transitioning at that time from being a birth doula to a birth midwife. So we'd been talking about doula work and midwife work and what that meant. And essentially, it's applying those same principles to people that are going through the dying process. And I think it makes sense to extend that to people that are going to be needing to make decisions about the dying making process. So that first inkling that this was really my calling was when I looked at something and was like, this isn't right. Like this needs to be better. And my dad kind of calls me an expert at fitting square pegs into round holes in terms of, I tend to look at a situation and on paper, everything there is what needs to be there. The parents have everything that they need in terms of support. And yet it's sort of like, no, there isn't. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to push this new idea in and it's going to fit alongside. But I didn't want to do it in a hospital setting. I didn't want to do it. I really wanted to work with individuals. And as that work progressed, you know, it became really clear that this wasn't actually the first time at all that I'd had this realization. And the other thing that I really hearken to in terms of calling and is when I feel really settled in myself when I'm doing this work. And the first time I felt really settled in myself was when my mom's mother died. And my mom and her mother had a very difficult relationship. My grandmother was a very difficult woman who was just born at the wrong time. You know, just should have been born in a different decade. But through her dying process, my mom was there, really without hospice support, but was just there at the bedside. And it taught me so much about what it means to kind of put aside your own needs and be there and fully be present in a moment where you don't know what's going to happen. And, you know, these phrases, being present, holding space, they get thrown around a lot, right? But what it really means is you don't get to dictate what happens. You know, there was no great revelation. There was no, like, you know, my grandmother she was very, very ill at the end, but, you know, there wasn't any, you know, "I've always loved you, even though, you know, I was really hard on you," or "I never really said that before in my life." You know, there wasn't a moment like this. And I don't think my mom was waiting for that moment to happen. And in fact, in discussions that I've had with her since then, that wasn't the case at all. You know, that she was just there because it felt right. And I was with her because I felt right. She didn't ask me to be there with her. So there's these moments in my life where it just felt like showing up in a certain way is when I've been fully and completely myself. I've never had to feel like I've had to put on an act or be someone else. And it's driven me to, you know, get my hands on everything, to read, to try out all sorts of different ways of doing this work. And I've never gotten tired. I've never gotten tired of learning more. I mean, and I'm a bit of a school junkie anyway. So, I mean, it's like, if I get afforded, I'd take every course. I'd love to be, have some social worker training to back up what I do, and have some, chaplaincy training to back up what I do. So, there's certificate courses and things out there for doing that. But it's that drive to always figure out, why is this person in need of support, and how do I support them, and how many tools can I bring to the table, and really then let them take control, because this is, first of all, a great unknown. Nobody knows what happens when we die, but also something we just don't talk about. Even when we talk about death, we're here in the middle of a pandemic. We're talking about people in Los Angeles dying one every 8 minutes, Los Angeles County right now, right? Or, one American dying every 30 seconds. We're not really talking about death. We're not talking about, for every person that dies, all of the people that are going to be affected by that, whether they miss them or there's a sense of relief because really maybe they were a terrible person or they were suffering a lot, whatever it is. We don't actually talk about death. And so it's just this sense of like, okay, there's the hole. We want to talk about it in nice, neat, easy answer ways. That's not how I want to talk about it. And that's not how I want to get people prepared for the process. If I meet people afterwards and I'm working with them in more of a funeral director capacity, I'm not going to say, okay, well, there's some pretty good outlines for here where we do this, 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 and this. And then you just go off and you deal with your feelings yourselves. I really want to know what people need. And the big thing there is they don't know what they need. And so why it feels like a calling for me is because over and over and over again, it's just this situation of, we're here in this space where this big unknown has happened. And I don't want to tell you what to do. I want to hear what you're thinking and you're feeling and help you figure out what you want to do. And that's just so different from me and ask anyone else in my life. Usually I'm in there giving my opinions and telling people what's right or what's wrong or how to, right? So something that again, just allows me to be so fully and completely myself without actually really bringing a lot of my own personal views to the table is really that like moment of like, oh, this is what I'm meant to be doing. Like, this is what my real skill set is.
There is so much there that I want to dig into. And that's really a wonderful response. We are not talking about death. And lately I've given quite a bit of thought to the way society and the social fabric will shift. And I know that, in Vermont, the numbers are low in comparison in Vermont. I was up there during the summer, and it seemed like a lot of that was, it's the last time I went out to eat was when I was in Vermont. It seemed like numbers were low enough to where we could go out to eat, and Vermont being the rural place that it is, I don't know that the environment in Vermont is similar to, obviously it's not the same kind of thing that's happening in Los Angeles County right now. But I guess since there's a space for this in this conversation at this point, how is the pandemic, has it shifted any of your mindset, or is it generating conversations, or how is it affecting your work, your mindset? Is there any sort of modifications to your approach, or are you getting more people asking you about death, or how has the pandemic affected you and your work?
There's so many ways to answer that. I have found that there are some people that have been thinking about talking about death, in particular, what they want when they die, how do they document their wishes, that are finally reaching out, so like, this is the time, like, okay, might as well do it now. But I've also found that in general, people are, I think, because, it's almost like you don't want to call it down, you don't want to jinx it, right? So I think, primarily what I've found is that people want to talk about, really want to talk around death. They want to talk about the mismanagement of the pandemic, or they want to talk, or, and so that, that's one thing. But I think the biggest impact of the pandemic, so right now I primarily work as a funeral director. And so what that's meant is, now we have social distancing, we have gathering size restrictions. For a long time in the spring through the summer, churches were closed, and a lot of the traditional places that people went for funerals and funeral services were just not available to them. And what people expect in terms of what's a very conventional model of somebody dies and you do a visitation and then you have, some sort of service and then you bury them, right? None of that could really take place in the way that people had been imagining. So it really forced me to take a big step back and to think about, what do people need when they're in mourning? Somebody's died. What do they need in this situation? Because a lot of the funeral industry and a lot of other people have just moved to doing things online, right? We're doing this interview online. We can just do it online. And first of all, I do live and work in Vermont. Online is a lot more complicated here, in terms of Wi-Fi access and where you live being pretty spotty in a lot of places. And also just people aren't really into the internet here. I mean, there's a lot of people either because of their age or because of their lifestyle of making conscious decisions. I mean, just the internet is just not a big driving force in Vermont culture.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously it's a great tool and many people use it, not trying to say that that's not the case, but just moving a funeral online just didn't feel like the right answer. So it was really thinking about and having conversations with people about what do you need. And what was great is it transitioned less into more open conversation about death and more into open conversation about grief, which is another thing that we're really socialized, especially as white people, to not talk about, to not do out loud, to not do for too long. And there were just, because there was this need to feel supported when people couldn't come over and hug you, and you couldn't have everybody that you wanted coming up, and you couldn't have this organic, experience of storytelling that happens when people gather when somebody dies, right? And you've got people that are there. Somebody's lived a long life that, knew them in childhood or knew them from work and knew them from retirement or knew them when they coached their kids' sports teams or whatever it is. You have all these different groups of people and you get this wonderful picture of a person, and that's really hard. And so how do you facilitate? Because what I think that does for people who are in mourning is it affirms for them, that someone has lived and that absence is real. They're not the only ones feeling it. Somebody dying can be this surreal experience of how can somebody be gone, right?
Right.
And so you're hearing these stories and people are using the past tense, and it's affirming the reality of death. It's affirming the validity of what they're feeling. And it's also supporting them in their grief. They're feeling seen, they're feeling heard, they're feeling validated. And so having conversations with people, and again, trying maybe not to use such hippie terminology of like, what do you need to feel seen, heard, and validated? This is Vermont. But and to say what would really be meaningful, and to work out things like putting directly in an obituary, that at 5:00 on this day of the week, on this particular date, we're asking everybody to make a martini or a virgin martini and raise a toast and say this, because this is what we did every day at 5:00. This was our ritual. And just to know that anybody that read the obituary was going to have a chance to do that and honor that person. And what that particular incident turned into was the entire neighborhood actually got together, stood at the ends of their driveways, and one neighbor went over and knocked on the door of the house where the person had died and got them to come to the window. And at 5:00, everyone stood in their driveway and held up their glasses and they said the toast together. And so this beautiful organic thing, and it was still at a distance. There was no hugging. There was no, but there was a moment of feeling held, and it's community. And, community is a big theme for me. But I think that is the biggest thing that's changed for me, is that these prescribed rituals, which I've never been particularly comfortable for me, are things that have now fallen apart because of the pandemic. And we need new rituals, and we need these rituals to really support what people actually need. That doesn't mean that maybe a church ritual or anything like that isn't a part of it, but we really need people to get more comfortable talking about, this is what I'm feeling. This is what I really miss. This is what would help me feel like other people understood what I was going through. So that's been the biggest change.
Right. Yeah. I mean, having attended a funeral recently, it seems like every time I attend a funeral, there's a couple of different things or a couple different thoughts that go through my head. One is I find that there's some resistance to like comporting my mind with the fact that this person is gone. So like you mentioned, it's like death is a surreal experience at times. And so what I find running through my head is, something to the end of like, maybe she's still alive. Maybe they're still alive in the coffin, sort of thing. And of course, that's, irrational. It's not true. And it's just something that maybe goes through my head. And I don't know if it goes through other people's head, but I find that probably comes from the surreal nature of death, and that it's hard to understand that a person is gone. And the other thing that goes through my head, or at least went through my head at this most recent funeral, um, was that funerals and rituals seem to be for the living. Like, it gives us something to do when we are paralyzed by bereavement, by grief, especially because death has been so removed. Death has been so removed from, I mean, as early back as like the first 10 or 20 years of the 20th century, people were still dying at home. People were not dying in hospitals. And it seemed like respectable middle class behavior and expectations were that somebody would die at home, not within hospice care or within a hospital. Um, so, and I do think that, in the way that the last funeral I went to was wrapped up unceremoniously, like just 25 minutes is all it was. Everybody was distanced. There wasn't a whole lot of hugging. I mean, people had difficulty even recognizing uh, relatives they hadn't seen in years because of the face mask situation and the glasses situation. And I even saw, some folks who were aging and such, who attended the funeral. Some of them didn't even get out of their car because they wanted to stay behind the closed glass windows of a vehicle. And so, but it left me with a sort of, I felt like I had been to half a funeral, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right.
And yeah, and so there is something missing out of our grieving process, and it's not to say that the grieving process was a complete, that left you with a completion or feeling of completion to begin with outside of pandemic times. And I think that later on in the conversation, we'll get to the grieving process and ceremonies and rituals lacking a certain something or having something missing later on in the conversation. But yeah, I totally hear what you're saying in that it was an awkward funeral. It felt somewhat incomplete, and it removed the substance out of a funeral. What I mean by that is that if funerals are for the living, if we do that as a way to proceed forward in a time of catharsis, doing half a funeral or being left with half a funeral within social distancing, we were left with the pageantry or the ceremony of it, but not any of the substance of it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. I was going to say, one of the things that a lot of people I think have felt that way, and there's also a lot of concern because some people are just foregoing doing anything at all right now, and saying we'll just do a celebration of life at another time when everybody can gather. And so we're in this very tricky spot where pretty much anybody that studies grief tells you, you can't hit pause on grief. People are grieving, right? And if you're waiting to have a ceremony or a ritual or some sort of support for that, that's really difficult. And so I just want to say, one of the things that I've seen that's worked really well during the pandemic, but also just in general, really just is a transformative experience for people that choose it, is green burial. And I think part of this is because, yes, funerals are for the living, but they are honoring somebody who has also been alive and is now no longer alive. And so that means they're a body, right? And this is another thing we don't talk about, that they're a body. And green burial gives the body something to do, right? You talked a little bit about we need something to do when we're grieving. And some of these really, long running cultural rituals, I think, are based on we need to do things. We need to stay a little bit busy when we're grieving. And I think that that's really healthy and they're really wonderful. But we don't talk a lot about what the body needs to do. And especially in situations where we're not doing open caskets, embalming is falling off, more and more people are choosing cremation. The work and the role of the body in a funeral service is gets complicated. And what Green Burial offers, and what offers it during the pandemic, is it gives the body this very active role in that the body itself is what's being returned to the earth. The body itself is going to go through that process of decomposition and become part of the earth. It's going to become part of the ecosystem where it's buried. It's a very literal and metaphorical transformation. And you, as the person attending or choosing a green burial, are involved in that. Whether or not you actively lower that body in the grave, you have made that choice for that to be what happens to the body. And I think that gives back some of the meaning and the substance to these rituals. And so I've seen people that have never considered green burial that were choosing it in part because it was outdoors, so they felt safer gathering. But also, there's many reasons, and that Vermonters are drawn to green burial. That many people are drawn to green burial, but wasn't something that they would have considered that they did. That had this incredibly positive experience for many reasons that we can talk about. But I think one of it is that it did give back acts of substance to that ceremony by giving this body this very, very important role in actually having the body have something to do, and that being an active choice that you had made, and you being the person that had chosen green burial, not
sure.
So that, I think, is just something that's really interesting to me, because I agree that socially distanced, without the engagement, the ceremonies do fall flat. And so one of the things about that is it is hard. And I don't think it's actually that you're the only one person. Like, could they possibly be alive in there? And it's not that goes away at green burial, because it's always a really hard moment when you start to put dirt on the casket, right?
Sure.
For most people, not, anyways, there's this moment where, oh my goodness, what if they, what are we doing? It's they're in a hole in the ground. And yet, because we know that something is going to come out of putting the body in the hole, something positive, growth, new cycles, I think that can help the grieving process move along in a more organic way than a lot of the more staid and conventional rituals. And especially when those conventional rituals are being really stripped of their substance because of the things that we need to do to stay safe right now.
Yeah, the concept of green burial, as you explain it, it occurs to me now that, recently I've been studying kind of how societies respond to mass death. And that might seem kind of morbid, but I'm just trying to understand what are some of the social ramifications that may result out of a death clicker in the bottom right-hand corner of mainstream media. And so I've gone back and looked at like 14th century Europe, when half of Europe died of the plague, and the American Civil War. And though those 2 points in history may seem kind of incommensurate, I think that it's interesting that you mentioned that there is a substance or fulfillment, or some of the actual meaningfulness has returned to funerals in the form of a green burial, because you're adding to the earth, or you're creating a new cycle. But I think that's also that is a remnant and a result of, because in the Civil War, everyone expected a sort of a corporeal sort of reconstitution and a family reunion in heaven. So this concept of heaven and needing to be reconstituted and meet up with your family in heaven, and part of what defined the notion of the good death during that era was that your body was in one shape, you were given a burial, you went through last rites or sacraments, or you did what you had to do spiritually to make your peace at the end. But as of now, in the year 2021, it seems like that sort of corporeal reconstitution is no longer necessary in the minds and hearts of the bereaved, to a certain degree, because religion, it's not that we've turned away from it completely, but that is certainly a religious notion. And so it honestly, like, it makes me smile to understand that this is the perspective we're taking on death, or this is the new way of treating death, that we are seeing ourselves as not as a sort of species superior thing, but as part of an ecosystem, as a member embedded within that system, to which we are now within the green burial system, creating a new cycle. And so that's exciting to me, and that perspective is, yeah. So before we get to talking about some of the other things you do, like the member of the National Home Funeral Alliance or being an advocate for green burial, um, I guess I want to ask you, because there's a line in an article as well where you said, the more I embrace working with death and the dying, the more I learn what truly matters, and the more I understand how I want to live. So another kind of subject of fascination for me is that folks who have a near-death experience or a brush with death and escape death or cheat death to a certain degree, they tend to approach life afterwards with like a vigor, with this, and this, they lead extraordinary lives. Like my buddy Nick Ross, who I interviewed on this show, he came through chemo after testicular cancer, and then he became a competitive bodybuilder. And the guy seems like he's living his best life now. I mean, he seems fulfilled. His relationships have changed. His work has seen notable improvements. He's also founded his own small business at this point. So I'm kind of in awe of how uh, people, when they get a brush with death, it leads them to having a more fulfilled life. And so I wonder if there is like a constant fuel in your lived experience, like always being around death. Does that somehow change or shape your personal life experience and mission? Does it leave you with a certain vigor because of the work that you do?
I mean, yes and no. And one thing, I mean, I want to acknowledge that there's a sense of, that there are layers of privilege in this answer. Because
Oh
there,
yeah.
there are, depending on the color of your skin, your economic status, where you live in the United States, living daily with the reality of death can be a very, very different experience from kind of what I'm going to be talking about in terms of, an okay off financially, not doing great, but I'm doing all right. White woman with a good family support that feels reasonably safe at most times in my community, right? It's a different. What I'm talking about is a different sense of mortality, and that life is finite. In a way that's not necessarily going to be ripped from me in a violent way. And so I just want to acknowledge that, because my lived experience is different from people that may be living with fears of gang violence or gun violence, or even violence from people that are supposed to keep them safe in the community or their medical institutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a very different reality, and I think the reaction to that is very different. But I do think that for me, there's this sense of, because I do a lot of work with people, right? I can't have people have, I call it your own good death. And that might involve that you die kicking and screaming, all the medical treatments that and you are in the hospital and you're not at home. And that may be what you need to do. But for a lot of people, it's how do I get comfortable with the fact that I'm mortal, and that means that I'm going to die. And a phrase that I got from a client is, how do people come into their relationship with their own mortality? And it's not this sense of like running around all the time being like, oh my God, I'm going to die. So do I want to buy this ice cream, or am I going to go,
Yeah.
it's not like that. But there's a certain question of, why am I not doing this now? And it comes up a lot with end of life planning when I'm talking with people and I'm talking to them about what they want, and when they're dying, what brings. So one of the questions I work with people is to try and come back for a quality of life framework. How do you live well until you die, right? Because dying is a process. It starts, basically the moment we're born. But it's something that it is not just those final few days when your body is really in declining, or that final moment where this, terrible accident or act of violence has happened and your life ends. And so people will talk about, I really, really love classical music. I hope somebody plays classical music at my bedside. And it's like, well, do you listen to classical music now? Do you?
Yeah.
No, I don't. And it's why are you not doing that now. And so for me, it's less a sense of vigor and more a sense of curiosity, and almost like a way of, almost like a dare to myself of like, why not now? Because again, I'm conditioned who I am in society, right? I'm supposed to be saving money. I'm supposed to be doing certain things. I'm supposed to be, there's things that I'm expected to do, and they're not necessarily the things that make me happy. And so if the things that make me happy are maybe a bit of breaking with convention, why wait?
Yeah.
Why wait until I'm financially stable to do this? I'm launching, attempting to launch a whole new business in the middle of a pandemic, because why wait? It's what I want to do. And so that is, I think, the change for me is living with death, living with the fact it's not two sides of a coin, right? I am a mortal being. There's a philosopher, a writer. He used to work as a pediatric hospice doctor in Toronto. His name is Stephen Jenkinson, and he writes about, if you can't look at a flower, I'm paraphrasing here, and appreciate a flower in bloom for the seed that it was, and for the dead flower that it will be, you're not fully appreciating the flower. And that is something that I try to kind of look at in terms of, I am somebody who's going to die. And if I fully appreciate myself, then I've got to honor that. And that means I don't know how much time I have. I don't know, and if there's something that's really going to make me happy, or something that I really need to do, I'm going to go towards that now. I'm not going to wait for the time to be right, because it makes me happy. So that means the time is now. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm giving everybody listening permission to go run around and do, obviously within reason.
Right.
But the bounds of that reason, I think, can be a lot broader than we give ourselves permission, a lot of times, to follow. And I just think that it's just like we can just need to be a little bit more curious and engaged. And like, life is this beautiful, incredibly hard, messy, sad, complicated thing. And we all feel so much, and that there's so many opportunities for joy, and it's always too short. Whether somebody dies at 108 or whether they die at 8 minutes old, or they die at 8 months gestation, life is always too short. So why not now? Why not now?
I love the way you place that. It's more like an urgency than it is sort of like a vigor, I suppose. So you also are a proponent of like talking about death, like you encourage talking about death.
I ruin dinner conversations with my family. Yeah.
You know what? I don't think that you it's funny, man. It's like you mentioned dinner conversations, and I feel like, so in speaking about death with people who are close to me, I have found that the heavy subject around death that has a potential of ruining dinner also has a great potential of forming closer bonds. Like if I start to speak about death with somebody who I know who is close to me, and then we stumble upon something that I didn't know about them, because I know that thing about them now, I feel closer to them. And our friendship, our bond, everything benefits from that sort of thing. It's almost like a shortcut to bonding within conversation, because something as universal as death, that leads to that is as individual as it is shared, can really lead to pertinent information that you really would. I mean, so there's this thing called a death deck. I don't know if you've seen something like that, but it's like
Yep.
a dinner game, and it might seem like kind of a morbid gift for Christmas, but we got one of those for my girlfriend's mother, and sometimes we're hoping that she plays that with her father in order to sort of or not with her father, I'm sorry, with her husband. So we're hoping that they can play that game and bond or speak about things that don't normally get spoken about, and as a consequence, maybe they'll be closer together or bond more. So can you tell me about the death cafe? Because I know that the concept of a death cafe seems really awesome. And then the more I thought about it, the more I was like, as a musician who gigs out and approaches business owners or bar owners of like, hey, can I come play in your space? And they like it, and I'll bring people, and everything works out. I just started imagining, asking a person across the counter, being like, hey, can I hold an event at your place? And they're like, yeah. And it's like, well, I want to have a death cafe where we all talk about death. Can you tell us about, because it just seems like asking or, trying to hold this kind of event, especially consistently, seems like it would have its own challenges. But please tell us about the death cafe.
Sure. I mean, so Death Cafe is an international movement, and it started 2000, early 2010-ish. Sweden and England got really popular with it. So I think that it's a little bit easier approaching venues because there is a little bit of name recognition. There's a little bit of traction. It's got this sort of little bit of like a little bit more European dry rye humor around, let's eat cake and talk about death. Like we're going to talk about something awful, so we're going to eat something really good.
Yeah.
But it was, it's time to take death out of the closet. I mean, there's sorts of things around it. I think that, so the Montpelier Death Cafe, which is currently on hiatus, but I mean, was meeting every month from 2014 to 2019 with a changing cast, people that came regularly, people that would come once, people that came sporadically, people that would come for a series of times and then go away. It is real value to community. We were fantastic. We had a fantastic spot where the owner was super engaged. She would come sometimes to, if the cafe was quiet, she would come or find somebody to cover. So we got really lucky in that we had that support from the beginning. But I think that first of all, we live in a capitalistic society, right? So money is always helps, right? If you can say to somebody, all right, we're going to be here at this time, and generally you don't have a lot of people here, so we can guarantee that everybody's going to come in and they're probably going to buy a coffee or a cup of tea, or maybe even something more substantial off your menu, or will pay to use this space. So it's money that's coming in, right? So that helps, and that's just the reality of doing things in the United States and most of the rest of the world, right? Is that helps the conversation. But I also think that it helps because, again, when people sit down and just like you were saying, when they have conversations about death, it is transformative. I mean, I use that word a lot but it is, you have to be in this very uncomfortable space. Mm-hmm. A lot of people come because they want to talk about the death of somebody that they know. But again, it's just like you can't actually talk about that without starting to think about the fact that you are also going to die. Yeah. A lot of the feelings that you have when somebody else has died are tapping into, whether you know it or not, your own fears about death and dying. And so it can become this very revelatory experience, and people get really deep and vulnerable. And it's great. We sort of general ground rules for the Death Cafe movement is that there's confidentiality, and it's similar to people that are in recovery going to meetings where anything can be said in the room, but really nothing is going to be said outside the room about a specific person and what was specifically said. Things are talked to. Confidentiality is really important to have that happen in a space. And I am somebody that thinks a lot about space in general, and what happens in a space, how space is designed, and what space allows to happen, right? So if you're sitting in a back corner, I've been in a death cafe where it was like in a back dark corner, and it felt like we were kind of like being hidden from everybody else, and that conversation never really took off. And maybe it was just the chemistry of that group of people, but I kind of think it was a little bit about that space. And so I think that for, again, being based in Vermont, thinking about this really in terms of Vermont, coffee shops, places, libraries, things that might be drawn to hosting death cafes are community centers already. And now we're offering them the space for this space to take on this new, like almost sacred meaning of where people can come and get deeply vulnerable with themselves. I don't think that it's an accident that a lot of recovery meetings take place in churches, for example, right? A church already kind of has that sense for a lot of people. And so now we're creating that, and you can create that in another space. And so I think that for me, I haven't had to pitch a death cafe in a while. What's interesting is it's come up a bit with green burial, where towns in Vermont are really interested. They want to have a green burial space, but their cemetery is not into it. The cemetery doesn't want to do burial without vaults because that's going to make cemetery maintenance a lot harder. The vaults are the concrete liners that go inside the grave.
Right.
And so they start thinking about, okay, well, we have a town forest. Maybe we could do burial in a town forest. And people say, well, no, we don't want dead bodies in our town forest. And it's like, okay, do you go and you pick up the squirrels and the deer and like everything else? Because death is already happening in your town forest. I mean, I know there's a difference, and I don't in any way want to dismiss the sacredness of a dead human body, but it's just this idea that somehow we don't want death happening here. We don't want, people won't come and walk on the trails. And it's like, well, we're also not going to be burying people under the trails. And if you walk in a church, if you're in an old enough church, you're walking over a dead person, because people used to be buried under the floors of the church, right? So it's just,
of course,
it's just this weird disconnect. So that's actually more where I come up against that. And what's interesting is there's less of a money offer to make to people in that situation. Cemetery spaces aren't taxed. Towns can't make money off of it. So what I'm trying to offer people in terms of, why do you want to create this space? Why do you maybe want to use your town forest for this? And first of all, I don't think it's really going to scare away people coming that want to hike and enjoy your town forest, again, because it's just this natural process, right? It's going to improve the health of your town forest. It's also going to help with conservation. And town forests, are things that towns can turn into malls if they, get enough votes for it. But if there's a cemetery, if there's bodies that are buried there, there's a layer of protection. And so even in Vermont, where we have a lot of open space, people are very passionate about conserving and protecting and maintaining that open space. And that is a trade-off that I've offered. And that often will get communities more engaged with, like, okay, if we have this space, maybe this is a good thing to do with this space. So it's interesting in that I think that the way that gets over is that you have to show that there's a benefit to it. And the immediate benefit of people are going to have this great experience because of the burial that is the type of burial that's happening, or people are going to have this great experience because they've gotten really vulnerable and shared, isn't necessarily going to be what gets you in the door. What's going to get you in the door is, and they're going to be buying your goods and services, and they're going to be having this relationship to your space that's really positive. And you're not going to have to worry about, your town forest being turned into a mall in 10 years, so it's just, but you just have to find a way to get the door open. Because the other thing about talking about death, and I have to give my family credit, because, it went from, like, when I would talk about death at the dinner table to there being like just total silence, to now, like, I'm everybody's death person. People are constantly forwarding me articles. They're asking me, when I die, can I do this? I mean, literally at one of my cousin's weddings, one of my mom's generation's cousins was like, during the vows, was asking me about green burial. And it was like, time and place, dude, like, I really want to have this conversation with you, but I also really want to watch my cousin get married, like, so it's just opening that door. It's like floodgates. People really want to talk about death. They just don't know it.
Yeah, it seems like everyone's ears perk up whenever you mention death and start talking about it, because it is pertinent to each of us as individuals. It is also something that is like kind of a great unknown. So there is an interest there. And I mean, to me, it's fascinating. But it's taking me some time to come out of like this fascination, to find it more in a humanist perspective than it is just some sort of like existential or maybe even morbid at times. Because I was mentioning to you that, my folks, my mom and my stepdad were both flight paramedics for a while. And then my stepfather is a medical investigator. So the conversations around death around my dinner table growing up were not in line with kind of some of the normal conversations around death. These conversations around death would be like, oh, hey, Rick, my stepfather, like, it's Monday. How's it going? He's like, oh, well, bodies kind of piled up over the weekend in the morgue. And so there was this sort of grim reality that was actualized and just very matter of fact in these conversations. And so I feel like So my stepfather working with the dead and being involved in the labor of death certainly gave death a presence of mind for me growing up. But and you learn because and when I turned 18, my stepfather actually got me a job working with medical examiner transport. So for a bit there, I was going to crime scenes and helping to transport bodies. Um, and you come to understand that if you treat it matter of factly, you don't necessarily need this reservoir of good faith or of you don't need like this reservoir of strength. You just handle it matter of factly. But that kind of approach goes out the window within your line of work because you specifically deal with end of life transitions. And so that is more emotional labor. On your end, it's like if I guess what I'm trying to say is that I am in awe of people who do work like you because there is a reservoir of something, whether it's strength, whether it's good faith, goodwill. Um, uh, you know, where do you get that reservoir? I guess is what I'm trying to ask. How do you obtain it? Because it's certainly necessary within your line of work.
Yeah. I mean, and I wish I really knew. It's interesting. So that you mentioned medical examiner transport, and in Vermont, there's no transport service. So funeral directors do transport.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So some of those scenes are really tough. People dying alone. You see a lot, and there's a lot of sadness there. There's also a lot of sadness when I'm working with a family and somebody is home, right? And so I think that one of the things that there is a matter of factness that's necessary. This comes into death is something that happens, and it is going to happen to every single one of us. And I've been told I'm a terrible person for saying that. At a talk I was giving about death and dying, it was in the title of the talk, and I started saying, thank you all for coming here because we're all in the back of the room said, what a terrible thing to say. And just sort of like, really didn't know how to respond to that. But I think that, so I think that this good death movement, and I'm going to come back, but this is way into how I've sort of figured out what I need is that movement. Again, there's so many layers of privilege there where we're talking about people dying at home and their favorite incense scent is burning and filling the room, and their family is there and they're surrounded by love, and it's peaceful and it's painless, and they just sort of off into whatever comes next, whatever they believe comes next, whatever happens, right? That is not what happens. Even in the best and most peaceful death scenarios, right? There's all sorts of emotions, very, very complicated. And then you see these scenes where that is not what's happened at all. It's violent, it's unexpected, it's unwanted, it's alone. And right, so there's just this reality, but the death is the same. You have a body now, right? Somebody is gone. That living person is gone in itself. There's just this sense of there is a body here that needs to be treated with respect because it housed somebody that somebody loved, no matter what condition it's in, no matter what circumstances surround the death. This body has been loved. And I have a job to do, but I need to do this with respect and with dignity for the fact that this was somebody who was loved on this earth, and so I'm going to also do my job with love. And to me, that ability to kind of drop into that, this is what I need to do in this moment, but I'm going to do it with love, is actually just regenerating in and of itself. Because to get a little, woo about it, love is a regenerating thing. Extrovert, introvert, we can talk about energy expend, but it's just like this idea of if you put love out in the world, you get love back. And so there's that's a little bit of a well that I draw on, because if I do, and it's also something that's come from, realizing that I carry my death with me everywhere I go. the why not now, but also to live with love, to choose love as often as possible and in every moment. And I'm not talking about romantic love. I mean, I'm just talking about like compassion and being a good person and respecting the fact that this is what's happened, and I have some skills here. So there's that, and then there's also just getting away from it as much as I can, and so it's interesting, but I don't find these two things to be in opposition. I'm very lucky. I live below this beautiful park, and I spend a lot of time walking in that park. I spend a lot of time in nature. I spend a lot of time in water. So, if it's the middle of winter, it's going to be a shower, a bath. If it's the summer, it's going to be a lake or a river. It's just, so there's this sense of like just quiet emergence in my own, I guess, living and my own aliveness. And just also the other thing is I've developed personal rituals to let things go. Because there is, what I'm doing is allowing people to be deeply vulnerable, but I am not necessarily sharing in the same way. So there's a lot of feelings. I've seen people lose husbands, and I'm married. I love my husband a lot, right? And it would be really sad if my husband died, but I can't kind of be there in that moment, like thinking about how sad I'd be if this was my husband. And I also can't, like come home that way. So I have to have a ritual for letting go of the fact that, no, it wasn't my husband at the scene. This was somebody else's husband. I helped them. And now I'm going to let them go. I'm going to carry them with me, but I'm going to let it all go. So those are the three things that I do. I live with love. I kind of immerse myself in my own livingness when I can. And I do have very deliberate rituals around, saying goodbye to the people that I've worked with, even if I never even know their names, which is sometimes the case at medical examiner scenes.
Right. Yeah. So much of, it occurred to me yesterday because I was interviewing Todd May, and Todd is a guy who wrote a book about death, and it's very accessible. It's a smaller book and it's easy to read, but he has, and it makes me wonder, because I read this book and there are so many things about this book that were like just little connections that were right there the entire time that maybe I didn't see. Right. But he talks about death as being something that is not a completion of anything. It's just a cutting off of, and it's a very unneat severance. Projects are ended like a novel in mid-sentence kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, but he wrote this book about death, and then he told me he was delivering a lecture, and somebody raised their hand and articulated that there is a difference between, say, being hit by a car and then slowly dying over the course of a year or two with a terminal disease, getting everything in order, whether that's Swedish death cleaning or bucket list items,
Right.
or things to that end. Would you say that, I mean, I have in my head, I feel like maybe the concept of a death doula in what is expected of them, or why somebody would ask a death doula to help them through that transition, would be so that they have that kind of latter death instead of the former, so they don't leave like a novel in mid-sentence, that they kind of clean up, make neat, and sever cleanly in such a way that not only is it not like a novel in mid-sentence, but they also give the living a way to honor them once they're dead as well. So I guess where I was going with that is that would you say that's the role of a death doula, is to kind of clean up what would otherwise be a very unneat or untidy severance?
I mean, it's certainly the way it's marketed. Right. So,
Okay.
so since I came to this work, right, you're definitely going to find it in Wikipedia. You're going to find all sorts of training programs for it. Yes. And I think that there's this idea of, we're going to give people that more stereotypical good death experience. Your affairs are in order. People know where your passwords are. You've said what you needed to say. And you have a sense of completion. And again, I mean, that can happen, and it's wonderful when it does, but it doesn't actually make it less messy. I like sort of the second part that you were saying of more like, it gives the people that are left behind a better sense of what they need to do.
Right.
And I think that this is part of why I made I do less work now as, I became a funeral director. So that means the way in which I am a death doula has changed, and that I'm no longer, with people at the bedside, or, with family members. I mean, in Vermont, a lot of times it was, people who lived here whose parents had moved down to Florida and their parents were dying and they couldn't be, how do you support someone over a distance? It's interesting with the pandemic, right? That I'd already had this sort of experience of talking people through how do you support people through dying when they're far away.
Yeah.
But so I think that, for me, a lot of the clients that I've worked with, it really comes down to accountability and less about neatness, less about, because I think that, there's that expression, when somebody dies, the whole universe dies, right? You take that world with you. And in a lot of death doula trainings, there is now elements of legacy work. How do you want to be remembered? How do you, what is it that you want people to carry on from you? And one of the things that I always ask people is, do you think that's what people would say about you? You want to be remembered for this. Do you think that's how people are going to remember you? And a lot of times the answer is no. And it's why not? And it's like, well, because, I've always wanted to, but I never do. Right. And so it's actually, I think a lot of times when people are initially doing the work, it's especially when it's mainly planning work and they're thinking ahead to when they're going to die and they're not necessarily at, in that end stage. It's about being held accountable for the things that they want to do so that they are remembered in the way that they want to be remembered, and that people understand that these are the things that were really important to them in their life. Not maybe all the awards that they won at work, but the fact that, that they saw their best friend marry somebody that made them really happy, or, or just, or that they solo through hike the Appalachian Trail, or just something that, like that was actually really, really important. And that was something that really defined who they were. So there's an accountability that I find that comes out of it. And that people that are working with a death doula, I think what changes in their dying process is, there's always stuff that isn't said, but there's more of a chance to reconcile that those things are not going to be said, that they haven't been said, and it's okay that they haven't been said. And so it's this very, very interesting work, because what is a good death, right? What does it mean to die well? All of these things are really great buzzwords that when you start to unpack them kind of fall apart. They're laden with privilege, they're laden with circumstances, they're laden with a lot of projections, and this goes back to, it's about being present and holding space. You don't get to dictate what happens in that space, but I think that there's a lot of sense of what's going to happen. There is a lot of like reconciliation and forgiveness and these, these things that sometimes do happen, but often don't. When I was working in hospice, because of my background coming out of a hospital and because of my background in ethics, because I have a brain injury, because my original degree was in neuroscience, I worked with a lot of people that were in nursing homes that had cognitive issues. And sometimes that related a lot to alcoholism. And a lot of these people were Vietnam vets and did not have family that were interested in being present for them when they were dying. And so I was surrogate family. And people would say to me, well, why don't you have them call and tell their family how much that they really love them? And it's like, well, A, they haven't asked to do that. B, what happens if they call and their family's like, no, fuck you. Like like you were a terrible father, a terrible person. We don't, And so for me, what that really struck a chord with and what I've carried into my work is that it does become about the individual. So just like the after piece is about the people that are left behind, the dying is really about the person. And so I've heard stories about people's lives that are how they want their story to go. And I've just received that story. In the back of my mind, I might be thinking, maybe that's not exactly how everyone else felt in that situation, right? But I'm not going to say that. That's not my role. My role is to hear and to receive the story and say, I hear you and I see you for who you are. And thank you for sharing your story with me. And so again, that's where that sense of completion and reconciliation, that sense of accountability I think that comes in for people that know that they're dying. It's not about big grand gestures. It's not about necessarily undoing what's been done or creating a whole new story. It's about having a narrative that makes sense and giving people that sense of that ability to have that for themselves. Even if that's very different from what their family or everyone else is going to feel. If I'm not there for the family, I'm there for them, and their dying experience gets to be about what they want, what they need, what they say. And that's just a very interesting thing, because it is kind of go counter to a lot of what we talk about, good death and dying well and all of that. What that means is not what I'm into. It's not what I do. And it's really not what the people I work with have in terms of their experiences. So
let's talk about a little bit, because I know you mentioned you don't really like the title of funeral director. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I really wish the term funeral doula had a better ring to it. I think part of this comes from, there are a lot of people who start as funeral directors or medical examiners that move into doing death doula work because they want a deeper connection with people and than what they're granted. So I've kind of done this journey in reverse, in that I was, a death doula and a home funeral guide and a Green Burial advocate first. And then finally I was like, okay, I'm going to actually, become a funeral director. Director itself is a really heavy word. I'm somebody that thinks deeply about language and the way that language impacts and also shapes experiences and relationships. But it's interesting that you've talked about, you've been looking at response to the Civil War and death in the Civil War, right? And that was the start, really, in the United States of professionalizing death and dying. And that was the start of dying moving out of the home, of this embalming becoming something that was not really done in the United States before the Civil War. And then all of a sudden it was something that could be done. And you literally had people following battles, with their arsenic and, prepping cadavers so that they could be sent home. And so many things about death now, where we are now in the US, in our culture, where we don't talk about death, I think come out of that professionalization of death being moved out of the home, the idea that you need to be some sort of professional to deal with death. Which again is ridiculous, because we all die. And the people that are helping you, these professionals, haven't died, because if they were dead, they couldn't help you. Although certain people might argue with that, and you could go to a medium and somebody could help you through that. So I don't like the professional idea of it, that somehow I do have skills. I have certain skills. I've learned certain things. I've studied a lot. I've been at a lot of bedsides of people who have died. I've had a lot of death in my own family. I had two of my own friends die when I was in college, my senior year in college. One was 19 and one was 21, right? There's these things that I can bring, but everybody else that lives also has skills that are going to help them navigate death. So title of funeral director just never sat very comfortably with me. And nor does the model of sort of the funeral director and funeral service industry, because a lot of what happens is people come in, and because you're the expert, then they ask you what to do. And they're asking you what to do about a person that you don't know, you've never met, it's all of these things. And I work in a small town. So, sometimes I often did know who the actual person, but, it's this very strange dynamic of, oh, you are now going to tell me what it is that I need to do. And it's this transactional experience, in terms of, for a certain amount of information, I will then do these sort of set things, and there's money that's exchanged for that. And I get, we live in a capitalist society, there has to be money exchange. I'm not necessarily against the exchange of money for the use of skills, but I didn't necessarily feel like I was using the skills that were really going to be helping people in that situation, because I wasn't helping them figure out what it was that they needed. And, to me, and I've often been made fun of by colleagues, because there's what they call, when somebody comes into a funeral home to arrange a service, it's called an arrangement conference. And mine are long. I take a long, I mean, people listening, right? I'm not short-winded. I've made peace with the fact that I'm never going to be concise. That's just not my strong suit. But I really want to sit down with people and have them tell me what they need. I don't want to say, okay, well, you mentioned that they were Catholic, so are we going to be doing a mass? Do you want to do the mass before the burial or after the burial? Like, I don't want to just like start firing off things at people. And a lot of times that means giving people a lot of chance to talk about the weather, or and to talk about, and then to talk about the dying experience and what actually happened, and then to talk about, I've had, when mothers, are coming in to bury their adult children, or to arrange services for their adult children, right? I hear their whole experience of part of what they need is to talk about their self as a mother, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't actually have a word in the English language for what it means to be a parent whose child is dead.
Right.
And this is something I also work with women that have experienced, and families, all people that have experienced pregnancy loss for any reason. And this is a big thing there. What do you, do you have a kid? Do you still get to call yourself a parent if your child was never born and breathed and all that? So once I find that people start telling me about their selves, their relationship to the person that died, right? So again, we've already established, I believe, you believe, really, funerals are for the living. What is it that they're going to need, right? We really need to honor the fact, in this case, in particular, I'm thinking of like mothers of adult children that have died, their motherhood. The fact that their child has died does not take that away from them. It does not mean that they were a bad mother. I don't know anything about the family dynamic. Maybe there wasn't a great, maybe there was an estrangement, maybe, right? But none of those things matter. What needs to happen is that there's going to be something in this service that acknowledges motherhood and the love that was there. So it is really bringing the doula skills and all the skills that I built up when I was doing work before I was a funeral director into doing the work, because I can't possibly be an expert in the person that you loved and your relationship to them and what you need. Now, once I start to learn a little bit more about what you need, then I can start offering things. We can maybe do this. How would this feel? What do you think about this? It helps to, be also really widely read and, connected to many people of different faith traditions and,
right.
And all that, and to offer, elements of things, but what it allows me to do when I'm not a director, when people don't come in with that expectation that I'm going to take over, that I only need certain bits of information, is for something much more organic to happen. And so that's really why I push back. There's not a better word for it yet that I can think of. Again, funeral doula just sounds, it just doesn't sound right. Right. But I don't want to be a death professional. I have people, I use end of life specialists. This is what I specialize in, but I'm not a death expert. I'm not a dying expert. I'm not a funeral expert. I'm just a person that does this work, and I want to help you. Facilitator. But it's these skills about, just letting people tell me about themselves and then hearing what it is. Okay, I'm hearing this. How do we meet this need? How do we do this? And I think that is just something that could really benefit a lot of people if we could just sort of change the culture around what happens when you step into an arrangement conference. And so that maybe just starts with a title change.
I think that's really interesting, because, how could you possibly be an expert in the person who has died, their loved ones, their family dynamic, what is special to them, what would help them grieve? And it's only by taking in that information that that you learn about them and are able to offer certain things to them. So the fact that you have very long arrangement meetings probably just speaks to your I think it speaks to your the empathic nature of maybe who you are as a person that is concerned with the humanist elements of this entire process. That is a deep thinker about words and terminologies and titles that hold a linguistic power to to assert a sort of shape over an experience or a space. And so I guess this leads us nicely into probably the aspect that I was most excited to speak to you about, which is, I know that you're the co-founder of Vermont Natural Burial. You are a green burial advocate, and you're president of Green Burial Vermont, and you're a board member of the National Home Funeral Alliance. All this stuff is awesome. But the one thing that really piqued my interest is another organization that you co-founded called the Collective for Radical Death Studies. Can you speak to that project and maybe speak towards the Eurocentrism and whiteness that undergirds the field of death studies?
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what that project, the collective was founded in part from a series of conversations that I had with its president, Dr. Cami Fletcher. So there's a woman, Caitlin Doty, and she's really well known. She's written many books about death. She's got a YouTube channel where she talks about death and dying. But she wanted to reclaim the word morbid. She wanted to, in a lot of ways. So she started a death salon, and this idea that we'd have a conference where people come together and talk about death and dying. And so Dr. Fletcher was there and kind of looking around and being like, why is this so white? And then I started thinking about my experiences and my training and everything that and this is right. This is what happens with privilege is you don't even notice that everyone in the room with you is white. All of my teachers have been white. All the books that I have read about death and dying were written by white people. My lived experiences as a white person, my family is very, very white. These are just right. So I was, one can only grow in it, but it was this moment of looking around and like being really uncomfortable with the fact of like, wow, there's really only one perspective being explored and examined in this room. Now, not that white is a monolith, and there's certainly many, many things, especially with class and privilege and ability, history, culture that are different within, what that white label is. But it does mean that things like the good death, and dying well tend to come from experiences that are more grounded in the privilege that white people have, a little bit that we talked about, that not living with the idea of the fact that you might die because a medical institution, it's just grounded into medical institutions, things that Black people don't feel pain in the same way or don't suffer in the same way, or are not as likely to have certain. It's just study after study has been done that's shown that these prejudices still exist in the medical industry, right? That you might be shot by a police officer who is someone that's supposed to be there to protect yourself, right? That's not something. So even when people are willing to talk about sudden death or violent death, when it's white people talking about it, right, we're missing a very, very large part of the people that need to actually speak to what that experience is and how that shapes grieving rituals. And I think one thing that I've learned a lot about is in the Black community in the United States, there's much more openness about grieving, right? There's say their names. You do talk about it. You talk about your sadness. You talk about your anger. You talk about the complexity of your emotions. The ceremonies and the rituals around honoring the body and the life of the dead person. So many times, especially for Black people, but many other marginalized people, death is the only time in which they truly get to be themselves. And oftentimes that can be stripped. I'm thinking particularly in the trans community. Their identity can actually end up being stripped away from them in death, right? So these are conversations that are not being had in the programs that are training death doulas, that are training funeral directors, because of the fact that, especially the funeral industry, there was a white funeral industry and there was a Black funeral industry, and they did not mix because white funeral directors did not deal with the Black community, and the Black community had, wasn't necessarily that they wouldn't deal with white people, but white people wouldn't go to Black funeral directors, right? That's just the history is there, and we can't deny it, and we can't ignore it. And so the collective, from kind of that conversation, Cami found, just started talking about it, and people that were drawn to, let's talk about how white these things are. Let's talk about how much of what we talk about is grounded in Eurocentric Christianity, even if we're not talking about God or religion overtly. This idea that 3 days is sacred, that we're going to have the service 3 days after somebody dies. Well, where does that come from, right? That comes from Christianity. There's also a lot of appropriation that's happening. You'll see a lot of people want to claim the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, right? And even that ceremony in Mexico has radically changed with consumerism. And, there was a James Bond movie that showed a parade, which you don't have parades, but now they do. And,
right.
And so, but one of the things that's troubling is that you'll see people that have no roots in Mexican culture, and Latina culture at all, that are now having Dia de los Muertos ceremonies. And it's like, okay, you're Irish. And if you go back to your own cultural history, there are some really, really awesome rituals and things in your own cultural history around death acceptance and celebrating death. My family is Scottish and Polish. I mean, it's like, if I want to go back and look at, pre-Christian Slavic traditions on the Polish side, there's some really interesting things around death there. There's obviously in the Celtic and the Gaelic community, going back into Druidism, there's so much there for me to unpack in my own culture. Why would I take from somebody else's? But it means examining, who am I? Where do I stand for? What are my prejudices? What are my biases? What are my blind spots? And it's, it's part of a larger conversation that we're attempting to have in the United States, in fits and starts and with varying degrees of success, about, white is not a culture, right? It's a way that we live in the world. It's a series of privileges that we carry into the world and into being, but it's not necessarily anything that, like, all white people do this. And so when we, kind of part of the thing that I really brought into when we were starting the collective is, like, my realization, again, I'm really drawn to words and language. So much of my learning has come from especially books, but media, movies, books, articles, and looking at, there is a shit ton of stuff out there that is not written by white people, but that we don't know about because it's not promoted in the same way. So for me, my big project was to create the Radical Death Canon, and to just start soliciting from all around the world and from many, many different groups. What do you read? What have you written? Where do we look at, and where do we find ideas of death and dying and rituals around death and dying, life, the meaning of this transition out of life from non-white, non-colonial, Christian traditions. And a lot of times it's, a paragraph or a chapter in a book, but there are books out there. There's movies, there's documentaries, there's oral histories, and it's there. So now we have this great library of resources in almost any type of media that you can imagine, that offers people an opportunity to start to engage with death in this way that is getting back into that authentic. I mean, that's a little bit judgmental. I don't want to say it's more authentic to get, but it's grounded into your own personal history, your own role in the world. And it's also giving and promoting works that have been done and written, own words of people that come from more marginalized communities that are talking about their experiences. And I think that that's really, really crucial, because that's how we break the cycle of these experiences being deemed less than, or weird, or strange, or, why are we doing certain things? Why are we only going to talk to the men? Why are we never going to admit that somebody is dying, right? All of these things are cultural traditions. And, it's not about cultural appropriation, and you can read all the books you want, but it's about having cultural humility and saying, I don't know about your culture. Teach me about your culture. And a lot of times people don't have a good sense of their own culture. And so if people want to learn more about it so that they can answer those questions for themselves, now they have resources to go and learn about, why is it in my culture that we never actually use the word death when somebody is dying? Where does that come from? What is the history there? And so that's, the hope is to really start to change them for individuals, but then for also all these training programs that are out there that are training death doulas to say like, hey, I'm white. I can't change the fact that I'm white, but I can change the fact that I am no longer unaware of the fact that everything that I was taught came from a white perspective, and a white perspective of being of a certain class, of being kind of from a more of a Christian background in the United States, and that is going to be radically different from many other people's experiences. And so I can be humble about what I don't know. And I can make space for what my idea of a good death might be, not being anyone else's, and everybody else getting to define that for themselves. And I've always used the term your own good death, but it really now is a much more global sense of own. And it really is also encouraging everybody to sort of look at, Christianity, and in particular Christianity and colonialism is just like, things were erased. Even within, white culture, things have been erased and taken away that are deeply meaningful and can be really meaningful for people to reconnect to. So being curious about one's own self and one's own background is just yet another doorway for people to then start talking about death, identity, and living. And that comes back to that, that vigor, that, what it is, what it means to kind of live with the reality of death. So I think that, there's so much to say, but I think that kind of just on the surface, that's sort of the important work, is just to recognize that there's a lot that needs to be added to the conversation, and there's a lot that doesn't need to be centered in the conversation anymore. We're pretty good with the white Christian death tradition. Like we all kind of have a decent understanding of that. Let's move that a little bit more to the side and try to bring more into the center things that don't fit so neatly into that.
I think I really love the way that you are expanding the conception of death and funeral ceremony within your green death advocacy, trying to center that not out of a place of Christianity, or maybe I guess just centering it in a way that is some adding more substance back into the ritual, because you are creating a new cycle of returning people to the earth and having so that is like an expansion of the typical conception of the funeral ceremony. And then with the Center for Radical Death Studies, I think it's timely, topical, and fascinating that that within the concept of that foundation, you are helping to sort of decolonize that, helping to sort of point out the Eurocentrism and whiteness and expand that outwardly in a more global sort of mindset. I don't know anybody else really trying to do that with death specifically. And I hope that we could maybe have you on at a later time as well to maybe have an entire show about the Center for Radical Death Studies. So I guess I have one more question for you. And that is, we were speaking a little bit before we started the interview about atheism. And I think that death is as unique as it is to us individually. It is largely the uniqueness of that depends upon spirituality, what you think happens after you die. And, so as a person who deals with end of life transitions, have you had secular clients in the past? And I know that you wouldn't bring your own beliefs into an end of life transition, but have you had secular clients in the past, and how does your methodology sort of change with a secular client versus somebody who is a theist or clearly believes that there's an afterlife?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because it's easy to say, well, I just meet people where they are and I ask them about, tell me their stories and tell me what they need, and I pick out on it, right? Or pick up on what it is, and we build out from there. Um, Death in particular, I think can, even though personally, I don't identify with an afterlife, or anything like that. But I think that for a lot of people, that holds a lot of meaning, and it holds a lot of the sense making that happens after somebody dies. So working with somebody that's secular, although that's a bit more comfortable for me because it's more in line with my own thinking, often creates challenges for family members that are not secular.
Right.
So one of the things that comes up there is how to create value, or help people see the value in having a secular ceremony, after somebody has died, or to not bring religion into their dying experience. And what I think can be really beautiful, and I'm not saying that this doesn't happen with religious services at all, but it really allows the person to come through, because we're really talking about the person, their life, their story. And we're designing something, and it fits again so neatly with Green Burial, because Green Burial, is something that doesn't have a cultural history, right? So we get to do whatever we want with it. So it just allows an opportunity for there to be space for what is created in terms of ritual, to be really, really grounded completely in that person, and not in any expectation about, okay, well, you know, there's time constraints. We only have so much time for a eulogy at the service because there's going to be a minister or a priest or something that's going to be talking for most of the rest, or we're going to need to do some readings that are going to take up this. I think that the challenges that it presents, though, are that how do we create a communal shared experience around something that's then so individualized? The Kaddish and the saying of the Kaddish in a Jewish burial, I think is something that is really incredible. I'm not Jewish. I grew up in a community that had a very large Jewish population, and something that everybody knows, has learned very early in their life, and saying it all together is very moving. But it's also very God based. So how do we create a communal experience that's not God based, that everybody can get on board with and feel is that important, and is that right? And so then again, is not all that different from the way I see my work with the Collective for Radial Death Studies, or anything else that I do, is what has meaning to you, right? And so if what we're going to do is we're going to play somebody's favorite song and everybody's going to sing along, or listen quietly or whatever, but let's look at the lyrics. Let's talk about why it was this person favorite song, or how it made them feel. And so that there's something that people can connect to, that this song made this person really, really happy. They always played this, and then on the first warm day of the summer, they'd roll their windows down, right, and take the car out, and that's what people are thinking about, whether or not they like the song, or if they're hearing it for the first time. There's something that they can connect to with that piece of music, and so we can create a communal experience from that. So that, I think, is the beauty and the challenge of working outside of a faith tradition, is that we get to make up something new, but we also need to find a way for that to resonate with everybody, hopefully resonate with everybody that's going to be participating in it. I've had enormous success with it. But I do think that for that success to happen, again, there has to be a level of humility, and there needs to be a willingness to engage. And I think that there are always people that are not always. I've had people give me feedback that say, but that they're really sad that there wasn't a priest, that the grave isn't consecrated, or that that their body wasn't blessed. And that's okay. It is okay that people have those feelings when they're invited into a secular ceremony. But what is not okay is if they didn't have something meaningful. And so my work is to find that balance in that. But was it at least meaningful when we did this, whatever it is that we did, that communal part of it. And hopefully that answer is yes. Because even if they didn't get quite everything that was important to them, they got something. And that is that's the balance, that's the work. And that's the reward, is just to see when that's something, and you can see it on the faces of whatever that activity, that communal experiences is, you can see people and it's like, yep, okay, we got it.
Right.
Because what happens after is people need to live in a world where that person is dead, and they will be dead every day until the people that love them are also dead. And so I think it's really helpful to give something to people that are going to have to deal with the loss individually, a collective experience that is rooted in that person, where they can say, where they can put, I use music a lot. You're a musician, so
Right,
but,
right.
but they can put that song on. They can say the words of that toast. If they know what a favorite color is, they can wear that color, and things can take on a new meaning because of that. And so it helps with the collective experience, and it helps with also the individual experience of living in a world where somebody you love is gone.
So, do you have any last advice or resources you'd like to recommend to our audience? Like just any sort of resources on confronting mortality, or how they can form their own good death. And how can listeners find you?
So my website really needs a lot of updating and revision, but best way to reach me is through my website, which my business is called Ending Well. And so the website is ending-well.com. And that is as soon as I hate technology. It's a wonderful, wonderful tool, but I hate technology. So I need to update my website. I need to, it just doesn't, why not now? Because I don't feel like it. It's one of those things that I need to actually do. So hopefully there's going to be a lot more on that website in terms of resources. Check out the Collective for Radical Death Studies. Look at the Radical Death canon that's there for people that want to start to learn more about their own cultural history about death. I think that can be a great revelatory experience. For people who are on Goodreads, I have a profile, Ending Well, on Goodreads, where I at least try to scan in all of the books that I have. And I've read parts. I haven't read all of them. I have read parts of all of them. And I'm trying to work in and actually get for myself things that are really resonating with me from the death canon, so that I can read and learn about them for myself. So that's another place where people want resources in terms of books, if other people are book lovers and word lovers. And then there's some stuff that we didn't talk about in terms of home death care, but I touched on it briefly when I said everyone has the skills to deal with death and to plan a ceremony and to care for a dead body. That's legal in all 50 states. Some 10 states require some sort of funeral director supervision. But if people want to learn more about that and to feel more confident in their ability to do that, the National Home Funeral Alliance website has some great resources. We're doing a lot of work there to kind of decolonize and decenter whiteness from that work. And so that's also going to be growing and changing, and will be more accessible and inclusive. Hopefully, that's our goal. But the facts and how to kind of get things done are there. And they do webinars that are great. So I just think, and visit a death cafe. There's a lot that are happening online right now. Start talking about death, whether it's Death Deck. There's another one, Morbid Curiosity, I think is the card game. That's a little bit more like Trivial Pursuit, because it talks about celebrity deaths and like weird death facts. But find your way in is the advice that I would give people listening. Is just find your way in to death, and it can feel really shallow and superficial, or maybe it is Green Burial. And sort of the cycle of things. This earth has supported you, so you want to support the earth, but find your way in, and then just be patient. It can take a while, but really do just make some space for this in your life, because you are going to die. Everybody is going to die. And I think that it can be enormously beneficial to how we live, to live with that. It can be enormously beneficial to the people we love, to have talked about it with them so that they know what matters to us. And just in general, I think it's what we need to look at as a society, to really kind of cut through the bullshit and look at, what really matters. People say be kind and all this stuff, and it's good, but and it's necessary and it's important work. But I think that one of the things that holds it back from really connecting and in that is the fact that we can pretend that something doesn't matter in this moment because we're always going to have another chance. We can always do it later. And that's just not true. We just don't know. So I just find your way into death because it's going to find you. No.
Well, that is a great place to end. I mean, I think this conversation was wonderful. Thank you for all of your expertise and wisdom. And I can tell that you're a very caring and empathic person, and there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into these discussions. So just thank you for sharing with us and being here. And I'm very happy about all of this, and this conversation was wonderful. It was delightful.
It was. Thank you so much. Like I said, I love talking about it, and it's great because this is just a way for people to find their way in. So I love this. I love that you're doing multiple conversations about this. I love all the different things that you're bringing into death, and I hope that it just helps people find their way in. So thank you for having me. And my putting up with my very, very long answers to everything, even this goodbye.
Well, that's it for episode 18 of No Easy Answers. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found value and meaningfulness in today's episode. As always, send your comments, concerns, criticisms, or vitriol to noeasyanswerspodcast@gmail.com. Support for No Easy Answers comes from listeners just like you, so if you would like to support the show, head to www.patreon.com/noeasyanswers and become a patron today. Music for No Easy Answers is always provided by Self-Taut, and you can find links to his music along with all of Michelle's links and resources in the show notes. Thank you again for listening, and thank you to all the people who are already supporting the show, and thank you to Michelle for being so generous with her time and wisdom. Until next time, take care, all my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. See ya.